It's my pleasure today to introduce Darren Boring, an affiliated attorney with the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network since July of 2011. We are beyond a decade of being teamed up, Darren. Wow. How cool is that?
That's amazing.
Yes. So you're an attorney in Ohio, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And in addition to, of course, doing your lawyer things, I recently became aware that you serve sometimes as a judge pro tem. So may I address you as your honor, or can I only do that if I'm in your courtroom?
You don't have to do that. That is such a short-term, part-term thing. It's completely unnecessary.
I couldn't help myself. I'm glad to see you're not in your robes. In addition, you're also a firearms instructor, and correct. I would go so far as to say, are you someone that we would consider kind of a Second Amendment rights activist? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Well, what should we know about Darren Boring?
I come from all different angles, actually. You're correct. I'm a practicing attorney that every once in a while fills in for a judge, and I jokingly tell people around here that it's like a substitute teacher. I get the phone call when a municipal court judge is on vacation or out sick or something like that. I'm a USCCA and an NRA certified instructor. As well, I've taken different classes such as your network / Masad Ayoub's Deadly Force Instructor Seminar, and I also play college professor on the side. I'm a senior adjunct professor teaching in the School of Business and in the Political Science Department at a small university in the area. Teach American government, constitutional law, business law. And truthfully, it was my business law studies that led me to where we're at today with the discussion and what I am concerned about with some things that don't necessarily address so much the Second Amendment, don't necessarily address so much as, a quote-unquote firearms issue, but it's something that faces instructors, faces FFLs, faces a lot of people in that industry that really concerns me.
Yeah, I saw it more as maybe the constitutionality issues of some of what you pointed me towards. And so to go there, you had expressed concern to me a few weeks ago about the Corporate Transparency Act. I've got to admit to you that I was not aware of it, and it's so far outside of our usual topic of discussion, I probably wouldn't have cottoned to it if you hadn't emailed me. And so your concern caught my attention. I did some reading, and to this layperson, to me, it seems like there's some big problems with warrantless searches, with unconstitutional requirements affecting privacy. And briefly, what is the Corporate Transparency Act, and why are we, the end users, why are we concerned?
Well, so this is a federal act that really snuck up on a lot of us. And again, it was doing some work for a business law class that I teach that I really wandered upon this and looking more at it. This is a new federal law that kicked into place in 2021 that has been slow rolled by the federal government. And long story made short, it requires small businesses to register with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division of the Department of the Treasury. And where I started sounding the alarm on this with FFLs and with firearms instructors and people like that is it requires you to register your ownership interest in a business. And if you don't do that, there are penalties, $10,000 plus penalties, 2 years in federal prison. And where this concerns me on this, and I've been silly with people before, and I've said, this applies to people that mow lawns, paint houses, as much as people that sell guns. So again, this is not a firearms issue. This is not a Second Amendment issue. But if you think about, just even the broad scope of our membership here, how many people have an LLC or an S corporation or something like that, that again are instructors, are FFLs or things like that, and this targets everybody.
Well, and beneficial ownership identification has been part of business reporting. I mean, that term, beneficial ownership, isn't new to some of us who've had to fill out forms and maybe get bank accounts for businesses and that type of thing. So, what's different now? Why the federal legislation is is the federal legislation on hold right now? Is it fully implemented? What's our current status?
So it is on hold for only a very small group of people, and if you belong to a national small business organization, and I think it was the National Small Business United, I believe was the name of the plaintiff, you are excluded from this. Otherwise, it is still applicable. A federal district court in Alabama said that this was unconstitutional, and essentially what they said is this is purview of the state government, not of the federal government. Federal government, you've once again overreached. This is impermissible, and permanently enjoined it again for that small group of plaintiffs. As we can expect, the Department of the Treasury immediately appealed that, and as of a check of just an hour ago, the oral argument schedule on this is, I think, sometime in the middle of September. So we're still quite a ways out from this being even remotely resolved. What the goal of this is, and the legislation on its face sounds good. Their stated goal is to stop money laundering, stop shell corporations, stop tax evasion. I mean, they're things that, for the most part, I'd say most of us are okay with. Where it's troubling is, in the past, like you said, that beneficial ownership information is something that in the past has been collected by financial institutions, and albeit none of us like going to the bank with a stack of paperwork and everything to open an account. There's some accountability there in that some of it is just from other financial legislation over the years, even with the genesis, some of it in the Patriot Act and other federal legislation to try and cut down, and again, money laundering and terrorism and everything. What changed, and what again makes me incredibly uncomfortable with this, is the fact that, like you said, this is a warrantless search, and essentially the plaintiffs in this case have made the argument that this is a warrantless search without, essentially probable cause. They used a different legal terminology for it, but it's essentially saying there's no probable cause. And not only is it that, this is just a wide sweeping net of everybody. Absolutely anybody that has an LLC, a corporation, under a certain amount of income a year, this applies to. And man, this just sounds so boring, but the reality of it is that it affects almost everybody. If all of the firearms instructors I know, of just the sheer list of clients in my law practice that have small businesses, under $5 million of revenue is a pretty high bar for a lot of small businesses, and it applies if it's under $5 million. And it's just, again, it's terribly concerning to me, because not only is there the prison aspect of it, for a failure to report, and once again we hear from the federal government essentially, we hear this in our world a lot, a mere paperwork error netted, what have you with the federal government, and again we talk about that, and what could amount to a paperwork error could equal federal prison time and everything else. That's one thing. My other concern on this is the idea that once the federal government has this information, again, doesn't this sound familiar from other conversations we've had about firearms registration and everything else? What happens to this information once it's disclosed to the federal government? And the reality of it is that the statute alone basically hands this over to the FBI, the ATF, the IRS. Everybody has their hands on this information, and I'll put in quote marks over here, for a law enforcement purpose. They can have this information. Well, any nexus to terrorism, any nexus to, whatever the latest, national security threat is, this information is accessible, and that's where it concerns me on this. Again, it's just a very broad overreach, and when I started looking at who this was going to impact, and again, it impacts landscapers, house painters, but where I've reached out to a lot of people in the firearms industry is, this is going to affect instructors. This is going to affect, almost any instructor I deal with in northeastern Ohio has a small business, and it's something that would qualify for registration here.
Well, that was the interesting thing, and we read in the language, and in some of the, I think was the National Small Business Association put out a kind of a white paper on it, and different resources, that there was a lot of reference to the exemptions from having to report, and I could never figure out which businesses were required to file and which got exemptions. I couldn't figure out. I mean, we're used to seeing thresholds based on income levels, and this almost sounded like it was driving down as opposed to driving up, which in my simple mind struck me as a little strange. What do you know about exemptions?
Well, I mean, the exemption list actually is comical. Banks, nonprofits, governmental entities, investment brokers, insurance agencies, utilities, things like that are exempt from this. Who they're aiming at is companies with under 20 employees, companies with under $5 million in revenue. You can look at that list and you can say, well, the insurance industry, that's heavily regulated and registered anyway. The financial industry, again, the same thing. This just seems like a really unfair poke at mom and pop. And we all see the jokes online that, the IRS is perfectly fine with money being lost overseas somewhere, but you take $601 from PayPal or any of those, and they're going to come looking. And this is exactly what this screams of, in my opinion.
Well, and I think that taking that to the end user is, are we accustomed to going down to the mom and pop gun store? Maybe they have 6 employees and they're all cousins. Are they going to be there in October when we go to buy our hunting rounds? Maybe we don't go there that often, and so you make a good point. And I guess a 3-part concern, if I may, I'm so used to seeing that beneficial ownership question from banks and financial institutions that they're previously required to report, when money laundering was indicated and those types of questions. How does shifting that reporting burden work, and to whom is it getting reassigned? How do the penalties for not reporting get enforced? And how would investigations of violations leading to penalties, how would that even come about? I'm just so baffled. It's so vague.
It is as vague and ineffective. Again, I hate to point, I've used the New York SAFE Act as a parallel in conversations of this, because we all know people didn't register in New York. We all know that people, essentially your noncompliance is not found out until something else happens. Well, in a case like this, you're forced to register if you own an interest in it. And it would be the organization that has the burden of registering, but essentially they have to disclose names, social security numbers, a photocopy of your driver's license or other state ID. You're forced to disclose that for anybody that has an ownership interest in the organization. And it strikes me as very problematic, because if you miss this, and I hate to keep coming back to this, but I look at how an FFL is getting picked on in society right now, and they don't dot an I, they don't cross a T. A minor clerical error opens them up to a revocation of their license. Well, if we look at the crossover of this, I can't tell you that if they don't, a small gun store doesn't register with the Financial Crimes Bureau on this, is the ATF going to start cross-checking records? Well, hey, mom and pop gun store down the street is an LLC because that's how they hold their FFL. We don't see them in the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division registry. And then are they going to go knock them out for failure to comply with that? Or and again, that's an example in our world here. But that could come in any industry. I mean, you file your tax return as an LLC. IRS cross-checks, we don't have that information with the Department of Treasury. Next thing you know, you're getting a fine letter in the mail or what have you. And enforcement information at this point is scant to none that I can find.
Okay. Well, and we'd prefer to avoid that altogether. Now, you indicated that it was stayed until a September, is it a circuit court? I'm not quite sure which court it was going up to.
At this point, it has stayed only for the small business. I think it's the Small Business United. Okay. It's not stayed for me and you that would have a small business. It has not stayed for us. It's only stayed for that group of plaintiffs.
Has the window for getting it overturned passed? What do citizens do?
No. So this is how I'm advising all of my small business clients.
Okay.
If you are registered with your state as an LLC or as a corporation prior to January 1st of 2024, your compliance is not required until January 1st of 2025. So at this point in time, pending federal litigation, pending the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ruling on that one way or the other, everybody that has a business that began before January 1 of this year is required to report by January 1 of next year. So I have at this point advised all clients, if you don't care to register, you do not have to do that until the close of business this calendar year. Where it gets tricky is if you have created a business, so you create an LLC, you create an organization in 2024, you have only 90 days to register that from the date of creation. So for instance, in Ohio, you would file an LLC with the Ohio Secretary of State. So within 90 days of that, you start the clock. From the day you receive your certificate of operation from the state of Ohio, you have 90 days to register, or else you face the fines, the penalties, the potential criminal and civil liability with that. My advice to clients at this point, whether I like it or not, it's I smile at them and I say, I think you need to comply within that 90-day window. I've actually had 2 clients on their own that I didn't even bring the issue up with that have declined to actually set up a business this year until they see what happens. I had a gentleman in my office, for instance, a couple weeks ago that is a veteran that keeps up on news and keeps up on things, and looked at me and said, well, what's the benefit of doing this now versus what's the benefit of waiting until January 1st to see what happens with an appeals court? And he's honest to goodness going to run his business as an unincorporated, unprotected sole proprietorship for a year because he doesn't want to give his driver's license and other things over to the federal government. I don't know if that's an overreaction. I don't know. Again, this is just such a weird space to be in, and it's just such an unconventional conversation to be having with people in the firearms world and in the Second Amendment world.
Well, and you brought up the sticking point, though, and I think that we are always trying to find that balance. At one point, I was developing some questions for you, and I thought, how do I even say this to someone I respect? But isn't this getting a little tinfoil hat-y? And yet, in many ways, when you start talking about those incursions into privacy, the thing about wanting to have a driver's license that now no longer requires a warrant to go into a further investigation, I crossed the question out. The deeper I read, the more I read, and it brings up an interesting point that takes us back to getting to know you, our affiliated attorney, the instructor Darren Boring, who teaches people how to be safe with guns. It creates this really interesting mesh of what strikes me as your concern for our individual rights and our well-being, and I compliment you on that. Why don't you close out by telling us a little bit about your classes, and if people just want to access the services that you have, a little bit more about who you are and how people can become your client.
Fantastic. Well, so I guess I'll end on this point with that and say I felt very tinfoil hat with this, and I've actually heard a lot of I have no idea of their political orientation and continuing eds and things that I've heard the same conversation. So I have questioned myself in the tinfoil hat on this a couple of times, but it's such an overreach, and it's a bizarre overreach that again is going to affect small business clients. And I'll end on this before I talk a little bit more about myself here. I've literally gone through my address book and my email and gone through my list of clients and have corresponded with every client that I know that has a small business that says these are compliance things you need to consider, and it's problematic, and that's why I'm taking the time to signal to organizations like yours, and it's my hope that places like the NSSF, and I haven't reached out to them to see if they have a position on this as well for what their members should do, but again this just affects so many people. I do feel like I'm being conspiratorial on this, and there are probably some people that think I'm crazy. Some people think, who cares? This is a corporate, transactional issue. This doesn't affect me. But I think it does, and that's unfortunately where I sit on that. So I will digress on that and say that I primarily teach classes in the firearms world on self-defense law, things like that. And while criminal law is not my forte or my expertise, I've spent enough time in the legal world that I think I can fluently talk and explain what your rights are, how to behave, what to look for, and things like that. And I think I mentioned at the beginning, I spent a week with Moss, and actually it would have been Art a couple years ago at
late Art Gosling, yes.
Art was awesome. I actually sat in the back row next to Art and Gail, and just had the time of my life that week, and their deadly force instructor. And so I teach a lot of that. You can find my stuff in my meager online presence with my company, which is 1791 Training. And I do some stuff here and there, and truth be told, I'm trying to do more of that as I see a need in the community. I'm doing more and more of that, and just really enjoy that with the college professor gig. I don't have much time to do actual active range training anymore with people. So it's mostly classroom that I do, but I love that.
Well, I think that there's plenty of competent people out there who can teach trigger pulling. There's not that many competent people out there who can teach mindset, who can teach how we react to certain situations, because we may not foresee the cascade that a sharp word might create, or a threatening action. And there's a great need for coaching with that, and it would make me happy to know that you were able to guide more people towards monitoring what we do, and being aware that there's legal consequences to things that, whether it's this bizarre little issue with the federal legislation, or the bigger issue of have we inadvertently committed assault or battery under our state law. Well, we don't know that unless we turn to someone like you and get a seminar with you. So it's good to hear you're doing that. We'll put the link to 1791 Training up, and Ohio people and people who are close thereunto, because there's room for regional influence, Darren. There really is. It would do my heart good to know that people were learning how to live more successful lives through training with you. Any takeaways, any last thoughts for us?
Again, I felt very conspiratorial about this. I chuckled when you brought that up, because even my wife has questioned at some point, aren't you making a bigger deal out of this? I'm not. And I'm grateful for the ability to talk about this with the membership, and again, to try and prevent the membership that's doing a great job. And we've got so many members that do share their knowledge and their expertise, and I'd hate for something as stupid as this to be what undercuts their ability to use their business and their time and everything to reach people in the community. So I think that's where this just comes full picture on this.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you for thinking of us. Thank you for thinking of our members, and keep us in the loop on this. It will be interesting to see September come, and if we can get a little bit more relief from it.